Good afternoon, this is Suxinity Talks on Education, developing writing skills in learners or writing as a skill. So how is it different from just knowing how to write a word, for instance? What does it entail? How do we teach it? These and other questions we'll try to answer today with Peter Nesbitt.
Hello.
Rob Wiley.
Hello.
And Gracia Guzman in Malaga. My name is... Question from one of our teachers in Malaga, Alexis. She was asking, often higher level students tell me they want to work on their writing. Is this recommended? For instance, ask them to write something or plan a writing activity. So Alexis, this talk is devoted pretty much to writing. I hope you find an answer to your question by the end of this talk. From my experience, I'm often approached by students and I hear this comment, oh, your teachers don't write, or we don't write, therefore I'm not practicing writing skills. So is that actually true? Because that tells me that maybe students are confusing spelling with knowing how to write meaningful messages. On the other hand, not all the instructions that we give students that contain the word to write are actually targeted at developing writing skills. So how do we do it exactly, and what does it entail, at what stage we start teaching writing? So Rob, my first question would be for you, and tell us, what do we understand when we talk about writing?
Okay, so we can first say that writing is one of the 4 macro skills. So we have 2 productive and 2 receptive. And so the receptive ones would be reading and listening, and the productive would be the speaking and the writing. Now we can kind of put the writing towards the end, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But yeah, basically it's just putting what you want to speak in a written format. So depending on what the student's needs are, is what we would associate it with. So with more adults, we would tend to be more like emails connected to work, presentations, this type of thing. And then for maybe younger people, it could be something just like social media, even, you know, how to send a WhatsApp or how to post on Facebook. So depending on the needs of the students, we would adapt it for that. And you can't always, you can't write without being able to speak.
Excellent. So there is kind of a natural order. We can't start up front with writing. There has to be something else before that.
Absolutely, yeah. So you can't, like I just said, you can't write unless you can speak. So we would first start understanding. So the listening skill would be first involved, and then the speaking, the reading come in, and then writing towards the end. So you have to make sure that your students can first speak properly before they write.
So, Gracia, my question for you, as someone who knows very well both educational systems, actually, the Spanish one, the English one, is how are students learning here in Spain? Is this natural order respected in the way that Rob explained, or what is your experience?
Okay, so actually it's not, because I remember when I was at school, and it continues being the same. English was taught in Spanish, and only the key words were said in English. So the listening wasn't developed as it should have been. So if we think that how babies learn to speak, they first listen to the parents and the people around them, then they copy. So students, first of all, can't copy from any structures. Then when it comes to the type of activities that are done, it's all about speaking. You have to think that there are big groups of kids in a class, so it's easier to set them in a gap-filling activity than just setting them in a free practice activity in writing or speaking. The only speaking that I remember doing at school was about answering a question that I have already answered in a written form. So for example, the teacher will set us to do an activity. I will answer the activity in my book, and then they will ask me the question and I will answer, but just reading. So it wasn't really a speaking activity, it was more like a reading activity more than anything. And it would be singing a song as a group. So really speaking didn't have room, or didn't have a space in the lesson, and writing was normally just more like a mechanic activity, gap filling or matching, more than actually producing something of your own.
We'll analyze now what type of activities we can use to activate writing skills. But before that, spelling and writing, there is a mixture here and misconceptions. The so-called orthographic competence, how is it different from knowing how to write, Peter?
Yeah. Well, I mean, spelling is important when it comes to writing. You can't really have, you can't write well without spelling well, but it's just one component. So, and I would say that accuracy here is really important when it comes to writing because, okay, when it comes to speaking, yes, accuracy is important, but the good thing about speaking is that whatever you say, as long as it's not recorded, it kind of disappears into the ether, whereas when you write something, it's always there. So you have to make sure that the way it's written is correct. But as well as spelling, you got to worry about other things as well when you're writing something. So, for example, punctuation. So we teach a lot of Spanish people, and in Spain they have similar punctuation, right? Maybe they don't use apostrophes so much, or maybe not at all. Not at all. And so things like possession, contractions. Now contractions are a bit different because you with formal writing you might not want to use them. You might want to use them with informal writing, and then you have other things such as the syntax, word order. And then there's a couple of things that are not necessarily specific to ESL, but they're still really important, especially when you're teaching advanced learners. And that's the register and the kind of the structure of the text. So when I say register, I mean like how polite do you want to be, how formal do you want to be. If you're writing an email to a client and you want to sell something, you might want to write a certain way. If you're writing an apology email and you work for the government, you might want to write a certain way. If you work for Netflix or something, you're going to write very informally. I mean, I've got emails from them that they're super informal and they use contractions too. So that's another thing. And then I mentioned before about the kind of the structure of the written text. So the way that scientific paper is structured is completely different to how a newspaper is structured, So depending on kind of where you put the most important information, where you put the summary, the conclusions, and that sort of stuff. So there are lots of things that you need to worry about when it comes to writing. It's not just about spelling.
Obviously, there is a lot of linguistic knowledge prior to being able to write. Okay, so
Correct,
at what stage, Rob, when do we start considering writing tasks for students?
Well, like I mentioned, you can't do it unless you can speak to the student or has to have a certain level of English before they can start writing. And I mean, but you can do it at a very low level as well, even if it's something like, I don't know, write a postcard or write simple sentences presenting yourself or an invitation, something like that. And then as Peter mentioned, depending if it's a more advanced student, then you can go into more difficult areas.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Gracia, when we think of kids, teenagers and kids, when is it the right time to activate writing skills?
Well, first of all, when we speak about kids, they have to be confident using the writing. They have to know the alphabet. They have to know how to write in their own language first of all, and probably if they find difficult writing in their own language, how they're going to write in their target language. But that doesn't mean that they cannot speak in that language. So I would say that probably until they are not 8 or 9 or so, would then start asking them to write. And if they start writing, maybe simple sentences, but I would focus more on the speaking more than anything, because then the writing comes afterwards when they are more fluent even in their own language.
And what about teenagers? What would they need to write?
Well, teenagers can write emails, they can write it, as Rob was saying before, as well as social media, because these days that's the way probably they write the most, messages to their friends. Also, they can write essays, they can write, because in high school they will be writing probably essays to analyze some topics. Even a news article, a recount as well of what happened over the weekend or what happened in a certain trip that they went with school, for example. So they will need to develop different writing styles, and more formal and more informal ones.
Okay, and when we think of the different activities that we can offer to students, what type of practices can we activate? Rob? What type of activities?
I mean, I guess like we were talking about before, Gracia just mentioned then something that they can relate to, maybe like a holiday or something like that. So I mentioned about a postcard, something simple, like writing a postcard. I know not many people write postcards nowadays, but something like that, I guess.
Yeah, I think that when you talk about like task-based learning, and it's good to learn how to write something. For example, something they need to do. So if they need to write emails for their job, then practice writing emails with each other. And then in previous videos or previous talks, we talked about like the PPP method of teaching and how there's one part's production, one part's practice. And I'd say that when it comes to practicing, if you want to practice at writing an email, then maybe deconstruct the email for them. So what's the beginning, the intro, the conclusion, the middle bit. Perhaps you can structure it together. You can, it doesn't have to just be gap filling. It can be maybe turn this short email into something that's a bit longer. Or actually, it's probably better if you make a longer text shorter, because that's usually the most important thing. So, but when I say the other way is kind of you have the bare framework or structure of the email. Now build the email from that. So that's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay, so you guys mentioned gap fill practice. Gracia, can you explain to us what is that activity? What type of activity is the gap fill?
Definitely not a communicative one. It's more like a mechanic activity. Very early on, kids learn that they have to, for example, they have 5 words and they have to put them in the right order. So it's more like I'll give a chance to see whether this is the correct one. So it's just a matter of copying. They don't even have to understand the sentence, so they don't assimilate what the sentence structure is. So, for example, I would recommend more like a rewriting a sentence or giving them a few elements that they have to put together in a sentence. For example, you can give them a noun, a verb, and an adjective, and they can put them in the right order and add the verbs and add the subject and everything. That would be much more, that would be practicing the writing skill, the productive skill, more than just copying or just being very mechanic.
Let's think, how do we teach writing actually? How is writing taught? Do we use it in a written way? Do we write while we teach writing? How is it actually done?
First of all, I think it's worth pointing out that if anyone watched the previous talk we did last week, this is where the idea came for talking about writing today. And I mentioned briefly about how you should focus on the certain skills. So if you want someone to learn how to speak, then get them to speak, because that way you're practicing. And the same should really apply for writing. However, actually having thought about this, you don't just have to practice writing through writing. I mean, I'd say through the production stage of a lesson, then yes, get someone to produce a piece of writing, and then the teacher can correct it in a certain way. But actually, when you're teaching writing, when the teacher is showing them different tips and different ways in how to write, then that can be done in other ways.
That's great. And Gracia, an advice on your side?
Yeah, well, so for example, when I was teaching in England and I was teaching kids how to write different type of texts, one of the techniques that I found that was the most effective was one by Pi Corbett, that is Talk for Writing. So by this approach, what we did was to, first of all, read a text. We always have to have a sample text. The same as when we are developing the students' speaking skills, we model what they have to say. With writing is the same. We have to show them like a written text that they can copy and they can assimilate. So what we used to do was just going through the text and speak about it. So what is included in each of the sections, what type of words we can use, what is it about, so they get a good understanding of the text. After that as well, what we will do is modify the text or change some elements of it in writing again. So they can see how, for example, the same sentence structure can be used even if we speak about another topic. And then something that I think is key for any time that someone has to produce a piece of writing is a brainstorming. And brainstorming is best done speaking, especially if you have a group of people, because they can get different ideas and they can assimilate them. Then we can put them in order in speaking. And then when it comes to the production time, when we speak about writing, is something that they do on their own, that they can do at their own time. I think that there is not much point for a teacher to be sitting next to a student while they write and just waiting there. It's much more useful to go through, speak about what they're going to write, that they can actually express their ideas and put them in the right order. So then when it comes to put pen in paper, they know what they're going to write about. We have to think that writing is a productive skill, yes, but there is more thought in it, so if first you have fired all your ideas, then when it comes to writing, you will be more effective, and also you can think more of the structure, whether you can change you can think more about the punctuation, the type of words that you're going to choose. If you have spoken about it first, then definitely they're going to be much better.
Think of how we teach a speaking class. So these are the typical classes that we would do. And I'll go back to the whole PPP thing. So you mentioned that we introduce something, we have a part where the teacher helps the student and they practice together, and then they go and they do something by themselves, and then the teacher corrects. So likewise, when you're teaching writing, you may teach them something like the passive voice, and passive voice actually is very typical in writing. So you probably get that more in writing than what you would do in speaking. So you'd maybe say, okay, let's have a look at this part of the English language. Let's practice it together, and now you go and produce it. And as Gracia says, this doesn't have to be done in real time. It can be done in an hour's break, or the next day, or the next time you see them. And then when they come back, the teacher then has to correct what they see. Well, instead of what they hear, it's what they see. And by correcting, it's not just get a red pen, circle, this is wrong, this is what it should be. Because if you remember, we talked before about autocorrection and different ways that you correct students and how some are better than others. And we talked about errors and mistakes. Does the student already know the answer? Is it brand new information? If it's brand new information, maybe you should teach them it. If they don't know, if you think they should already know the answer, then try and elicit it from them. You can elicit verbally, because if it's a grammatical structure and they're able to say it, then they are able to grammatically write it well on a piece of paper, and then of course you check for spelling and punctuation, things like that.
So we have a question here from Josh, and it's in the line that you were just explaining. So Josh asks, when do we practice writing? During the class, as an activity, or as a homework? But you kind of explained that.
Yeah, so two things. So practice and production, right? So practice together, because you're the teach, and also with the class as well. So if you've got a class that's got more than one person, more than one student, then do it together. And do that together in the class, so that you're helping the student, you're giving them you're showing your kind of worth as a teacher. Production. No, give them time.
I mean, they can do it at home, right?
Yeah.
They can do it overnight and then go back the next class, and like you say, just make sure you then explain in the next class. Don't just go with your red pen across everything. Like I remember when I was at school, it often was just like red crosses everywhere and underlined, and there was no real explanation maybe as to why it was wrong.
It's true.
As Alexis points out, maybe it has to be, writing activities has to be done as a homework. Otherwise, we are wasting precious class time. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, and then Tom asks, what for you is the most effective teaching approach for teaching spelling?
Wow. Okay.
How do you teach spelling?
While we're thinking of that, maybe Gracia knows.
Yes. I mean, but
Gracia probably has more experience. Spelling is that Rob and I were brought up in the UK educational system, and they focus a lot on spelling, which it makes sense because spelling is a little bit random when it comes to English due to it's a little bit of a French language, it's a German language, it's a Latin language. So
there is a lot of focus. That's what I was going to say. I remember lots of times having little spelling tests, all through primary school as I went along, learn these 10, 15 words or whatever, and so rather than the grammar side of things, it was more focused on the spelling.
Yeah, sure.
Gracia?
Okay, well, so I have to say that now you say about spelling, that was one of the first things I was so shocked about when I started working in England, because I realized that kids' spelling was so bad. But then soon after, I realized because the English language it's not like Spanish. In Spanish, whatever you see is how it's pronounced. It's phonetically, it's quite a phonetic language. However, English is not. So the way we had to practice spelling unfortunately, was by memorizing, and given little tricks. So we had, for example, like a table where we will have the word written and they will copy it. Then they will cover and they will write it with the eyes closed. So they will try to memorize it and also memorize the actions that they have to do to remember the word. Another one as well was just to say little sentences, like for example, 2 sugars and 1 coffee. So for example, when they have two S's in a word or 2 C's, so they will have little things like that to memorize it and to practice it. Another one as well that I remember is that especially with the early age, maybe 4 or 5 years old, we used to practice spelling in different surfaces. So for example, with sand, they will draw it, and they will use as well like foam or in the air. So they will do it in different surfaces. So they will memorize that action they have to do to write their word.
One more thing to say about spelling is that we have to remember that time has moved on and we have technology to help us with spelling.
That's true.
So we can't think of the educational system to be like it was 100 years ago. Which, let's face it, a lot of young learning education is still quite archaic. So if you have technology that helps you, then maybe the emphasis shouldn't really be on spelling, and maybe it should be on something that a computer can pick up on. Maybe more grammar. I don't know.
Maybe.
I mean, there are some apps that do correct grammar, but inbuilt systems such as for spelling, they don't seem to work as well.
No. I mean, especially I think with autocorrect and stuff like that,
Yeah.
we kind of get a bit.
We just have to. I think that another thing about spelling, it's one more thing, is that there are such things as typos, obviously, and a typo is a lapse, but in writing. And actually, they're not so bad anymore. I see well-established news, BBC News, for example, they have typos in their articles because the most important thing to them is to get the message out quickly, not so much about accuracy.
Yeah.
So I'd say that actually, maybe we're moving away from the English language being so important for things to be spelled accurately.
So Rob, let's take this example. You teach the word accommodation, for instance, and you see that student is writing it down and the spelling is wrong. Do you correct the spelling? Do you say, oh, double C or double M? What?
Yeah, I mean, because sometimes we do have students who like to take notes,
Yeah.
and often if you can see that they will spell something wrong. So rather than me write it on a piece of paper and show them, which really is not so productive, I think it's better to spell it out loud, right? It gets them practicing the alphabet.
Yeah.
Often students will get mixed up between E and I and stuff like that. So I guess you're teaching spelling,
Yeah,
but verbally, orally. And
I still struggle with accommodation that word. So I mean, it's like I maybe now I've like taught myself, because actually in my job I sometimes have to use that word, and if you don't use the word a lot, then maybe you forget how it's spelled. But yeah, I still I still struggle with some English words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's like, as we said before, you don't always spell it as you say it, right?
Or you remember it incorrectly. You think, was it 1 C and 1 M, or was it 2 C's and 2 M's? And so you kind of don't know. Yeah. So.
Okay, we have a question from Scott. Actually, he says, when we talk about writing emails, do we wait until a student has high level, or we prepare a specific business activity, or how do we teach it?
I mean, again, even if a student has a very low level, they still may need to send emails in English. So you can still go over the basics with them. I mean, how to introduce, or how to start an email, how to finish an email correctly. This type of thing can be done at a relatively low level.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to. They don't have to have a high level to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, I'd say that. Okay, let's say that they are working in a job where they have to write emails, and their level of English is really low. Do you really think their manager is going to expect them to be sending like really fancy emails? I don't think so.
No.
They're going to be they're going to maybe try to get to that certain point, or they're required to send emails that are quite basic in terms of linguistics. So, but yeah, you can practice with them. You can get them, like something that's really easy to send is when you have data and you just are arranging data in a sentence. So, for example, you're booking a meeting and you have the time, the location, who's presenting, etc. And basically, it's forming a really simple email like that. There's very little sophistication needed there. So whereas when you've got, like I mentioned before, when you've got an email where you're trying to influence someone or you're sending a communication out, then it gets a little bit more complicated. So so to answer that question, you can teach how to write emails at all different levels.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes to go, but here's a very interesting question actually from Dan May. Do you think that introducing spelling in class can cause problems with pronunciation or vice versa? And let me address this question to Gracia, because she understands again how it can interfere.
Yeah, so I think that if you start introducing spelling and when they are not fluent, they will probably get confused because they are, well, especially Spanish speakers. Let's set this as an example. As I mentioned before, we are used to read in a very phonetic way, so we know that M and A is always ma, that's it. So if they read a word for the first time in English and they learn that, for example, make, they say make, they will always read the same, every time they see that letter or every time they see that those letters together, they will read it in the same way, and probably they will make mistakes because of that. Or they will try to read it as they read Spanish with the same sounds, and then again they will make mistakes. So I would definitely say that yes, it can interfere in the students' pronunciation. That is the key problem that Spanish speakers have. Same as, for example, the S at the beginning of a word. In Spanish, we don't have that. We always have an E in front of the S. So Spanish speaker will always say, for example, es Spanish, and they will try to add that because for them it's not natural to have that sound at the beginning of a word. So it's best that they first assimilate the sounds in the English language and then try and attempt to make those connections with whatever is being said and the word that they have represented there, and afterwards try to write it and produce it.
Okay, thank you. And then there is a very interesting question. What writing activities would you recommend for young children? Is a letter to Santa a good idea?
Yes, I think that is a good idea because that is something that they will probably do, depending if
on the age.
Yeah, the age and well, the country maybe. But creative writing, kids are really creative, so get them to write stories and things like that.
Yeah.
And I would say that if you really spark a kid's imagination, which at times that can be hard to do, and you really get them to flow and just write, then I think that, because let's face it, like sometimes when it comes to kids, it's like you want them to participate. And if you get them to write something, I think that's a good start, you know what I mean? So maybe don't be so, my advice maybe not to be so hard on the correction maybe. Just appreciate what they have written. But yeah, you can think of simple stories of everyday life.
I mean, once a kid's imagination gets going, they can think of all crazy sorts of things. And I think if we're thinking about in terms of teenagers, I mentioned before, social media, getting something to write, like a little post that you would post on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it may be. So again, you could, I don't know, a photo, everyone writes something, comments something, so you could even show them a photo, get them to comment about the photo, I don't know, something like that. I think it's important just to make it relative or, to the age.
Sure, that's most important. Not maybe because kids, and we shouldn't mistake kids with levels. Not every kid is beginner. Sometimes they may not be fluent. They'd be very well. Sometimes they're depends on the age and their family and things like that. So.
Okay, excellent. Well, we have more questions. We will answer them all. Unfortunately, we don't have much time, so just a brief wrap up. So you guys recommend that writing is taught probably once the students are fluent in speaking and they don't have problems in writing, producing a written message. Then you recommend that writing tasks can be, according to the level. Even kids can write, for instance, a letter to Santa. easy emails, have in mind the register and all the elements that participate in it. And for more advanced levels, suggest a little bit more complex tasks. Many thanks for watching. Those of you who want to share or would like to contribute with writing activities, feel free to join us at obscenity.com. See you next Friday.
Bye.
Bye.